Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about recognizing patterns of abuse and neglect. Abuse and neglect come in many forms and can affect people of all ages. As EMS providers, we often encounter patients in their homes or at scenes where signs of abuse might be present but not obvious. In fact, abuse is far more common than many realize. About 1 in 7 children in the US experience abuse or neglect in a year. Roughly 1 in 10 older adults are victims of elder abuse, and around 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. These numbers are alarming, and many cases go unreported because victims are afraid or unable to seek help. That's why you, as an EMS professional, play a crucial role. You might be the first or only person outside the family to see the warning signs. In this session, we'll cover the major forms of abuse and neglect, from child abuse to elder abuse, domestic violence, and abuse of dependent adults. We'll go over the signs and symptoms of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and of neglect. We'll discuss the psychological impact on victims, and most importantly, your responsibilities as EMS providers, how to recognize the signs, document your findings, and report suspected abuse. We'll also talk about the legal and ethical considerations and walk through some real world scenarios. By the end, you should feel more confident in spotting abuse and knowing what steps to take. Remember, recognizing abuse early and taking action can literally save lives. Let's get started. First, let's outline the major forms of abuse and neglect that we'll be discussing. Broadly, these can be categorized by the population affected. Child abuse and neglect refers to any non accidental harm to a person under 18 years old. It can be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, and it's usually perpetrated by a parent, caregiver, or someone responsible for the child's welfare. Child neglect, such as failing to provide food, shelter, or medical care, is also considered a form of child abuse. Children depend on adults, so when that trust is broken, the results can be devastating. Elder abuse involves harming an older adult, typically defined as age 60 or older. Often the abuser is a caregiver or a trusted person, like a family member. Forms of elder abuse include physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, for example, not providing basic care, and even financial exploitation, stealing money or resources from the elder. Many elders rely on others for help due to age or health issues, which can unfortunately make them targets for mistreatment. Intimate partner violence, IPV, also known as domestic violence, is abuse that occurs between romantic partners or spouses. This could be current or former partners. It isn't limited to physical violence. It also includes sexual violence, emotional or psychological abuse, and controlling behaviors like stalking. IPV is fundamentally about one partner exerting power and control over the other. It cuts across all ages, genders, and socioeconomic groups. Anyone can be a victim. Dependent adult abuse refers to abuse of adults, typically 18 to 59 years old, who have disabilities or impairments that make them dependent on others for care. Think of adults with physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, or severe illness who need caregivers. The abuse can mirror elder abuse in form: physical harm, sexual exploitation, emotional torment, or neglect by those entrusted with their care. Often the abusers are caregivers, family members, or staff in group homes or facilities. These adults may not be seniors, but they are vulnerable due to their dependence. Each of these categories shares common themes: a power imbalance, vulnerability of the victim, and the betrayal of trust. But there are also unique signs and scenarios with each. In the following slides, we'll dive deeper into each category and what you as an EMS provider should look for. Let's talk about child abuse and neglect in a bit more detail. By definition, child abuse is any recent act or failure to act by a parent or caregiver that results in harm or risk of harm to a child. This includes direct acts like hitting or shaking a baby, physical abuse, as well as sexual abuse. This includes any sexual activity involving a child as a minor, they cannot consent to it, and emotional abuse, like constant belittling or terrorizing a child. Neglect is also a huge part of child maltreatment. That's when a caregiver fails to provide for a child's basic needs, whether it's food, shelter, supervision, education, or medical care. For example, a child being consistently left without proper supervision or living in filthy conditions with no food would be neglect. Child abuse often occurs within the family or household, perpetrated by parents, guardians, or babysitters, people the child depends on. However, abuse can also come from others like family friends, authority figures, or even strangers, though the law typically focuses on caregivers. What makes this especially tragic is that children often can't speak up. They may be too young to understand or communicate, or they might be threatened to stay silent. They often love or trust the abuser and may feel confused or guilty, thinking the abuse is their fault. From an EMS perspective, you might encounter child abuse in many ways. Maybe you're called for a child who is not acting right, or has an injury that the caregiver says happened from a fall. As a provider, you have to quietly ask yourself, do the injuries match the story? Does the pattern of bruises or burns suggest something else? We'll get into specific signs on later slides, but common red flags include injuries in various stages of healing, indicating repeated harm over time, and injuries located in places that don't fit an accident, like bruises on the back or thighs of a toddler. Remember, children normally get scrapes and bruises from play, but certain kinds of injuries are not normal. Unfortunately, child abuse is widespread. In 2022, over 550,000 confirmed cases of child abuse and neglect were reported in the US, and it's estimated that about 1 in 7 children overall experience abuse or neglect each year, and that's just known cases. Many others are never reported. The long term impact on these kids can be huge: physical injuries, even death in severe cases, emotional trauma, learning and behavior problems, and a higher risk of health issues throughout their life. The good news is that early intervention can make a difference. As EMS providers, if we recognize possible abuse and report it, Child Protective Services can step in to investigate and potentially remove the child from harm or offer services to the family. In a later scenario, we'll walk through an example of what a child abuse call might look like and how an EMS provider should respond. Now let's discuss elder abuse and neglect. Elder abuse is when an older person, commonly defined as age 60 or older, is harmed by someone in a position of trust or care. This could be an adult child, a caregiver, a nursing home aide, or even a spouse. It includes several types: physical abuse, for example, hitting, pushing, or using physical restraints inappropriately; sexual abuse, any non consensual sexual contact with an elder who may be unable to resist or understand; emotional or psychological abuse, such as insults, threats, harassment, or intimidation that cause fear or distress; and neglect, which is extremely common, meaning the caregiver is not providing necessary care. Neglect might look like an elder not being given food, medicine, or help with hygiene. There's also financial abuse, where someone exploits an older person's finances, stealing money, forging checks, or coercing them into financial transactions. Though, as EMS, you might not directly see the financial aspect on a call, it's good to be aware of it. Elders who are abused often have chronic health conditions or cognitive impairments like dementia that make them dependent on others. This dependency can unfortunately be exploited. For instance, an elderly woman with dementia might be physically rough handled by an overwhelmed caregiver, or an older man who is bedridden might be left in bed for days without being cleaned or fed. Sometimes the abuse is intentional cruelty. Other times it might stem from caregiver stress or lack of resources, but either way, the elder suffers harm. How common is elder abuse? It's more common than we think. Estimates suggest about 1 in 10 older adults living at home experience some form of abuse or neglect each year. And like with other forms of abuse, many cases go unreported. One reason is that elders might be afraid to speak up. They may depend on the abuser for care and fear retaliation or being abandoned. Others might be unable to report due to cognitive issues or illness. I'll give you a quick example. Imagine you arrive for a call about an unwell senior and find a frail 80-year-old man who is dehydrated, with pressure ulcers and soiled clothing. His living conditions are squalid. His caregiver, maybe an adult child, might shrug it off and say, "Oh, he refuses to eat or let me clean him." But you might suspect that the caregiver is actually neglecting the elder's needs. If you see unexplained bruises or fractures on that patient, perhaps the caregiver claims he falls a lot, you should consider if those injuries could be from physical abuse like rough handling. Also, pay attention to the elder's demeanor. Is he fearful or withdrawn around the caregiver? That could be a clue. From the EMS standpoint, elder abuse can be subtle to detect. Our elderly patients might present with non-specific complaints, weakness, confusion, or injuries that could be accidental, so it requires a bit of detective work and awareness of context. In upcoming slides, we'll talk about specific signs, like bruising patterns, malnutrition, etc., that should raise your suspicion. We'll also later discuss what to do if you suspect an elder is being abused, because as healthcare providers, we often have a legal obligation to report it. Next, let's focus on intimate partner violence, IPV, which you'll also hear referred to as domestic violence or domestic abuse. This is a bit different from child or elder abuse because it's between adults, or sometimes teen dating partners, in an intimate relationship, such as spouses, boyfriend/girlfriend, ex-spouses, etc. IPV is defined as abuse or aggression that occurs in a romantic relationship. It can happen to people of any gender or sexual orientation. A key thing to understand about IPV is that it's usually not a one-time incident, but a pattern of behavior used by one partner to gain power and control over the other. This pattern can include a range of abusive behaviors, Physical violence like hitting, punching, kicking, slapping, choking, using weapons, any form of physical harm. Sexual violence, forcing a partner into sexual acts without consent, which can include rape or other unwanted sexual contact, and even things like reproductive coercion, sabotaging birth control, etc. Even when in an intimate relationship, consent is still needed. Stalking, like repeated unwanted attention or monitoring that instills fear, like following the victim, constant harassment, showing up uninvited, or tracking their phone. Psychological aggression, this includes verbal abuse like insults, yelling, threats, and nonverbal tactics like destroying property, controlling access to friends, family, controlling finances, aimed at breaking the victim's will or isolating them. Gaslighting or making the victim question their sanity is another example. Often these forms occur together. For instance, an abuser might both physically hurt their partner and also control all the money and constantly belittle them, creating a situation where the victim feels trapped and worthless. Finally, let's cover dependent adult abuse. This category is about adults who are not seniors, but who, due to disability or illness, rely on others for their day to day care. For instance, imagine a 30-year-old man with severe cerebral palsy who cannot speak and uses a wheelchair, or a 45-year-old woman with an intellectual disability living in a group home. These individuals are vulnerable adults. They might need help with basic activities, feeding, bathing, moving around, or may not be able to advocate for themselves. Dependent adult abuse includes the same kinds of mistreatment we've discussed: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and/or financial abuse. In terms of where this happens, it could be in private homes, by family or hired caregivers, or in institutional settings like group homes, assisted living, etc. Unfortunately, like other abuses, it's often underreported. A dependent adult might have difficulty communicating. Perhaps they are nonverbal or have limited speech, so they can't tell anyone what's happening. Or they might have been taught to be compliant and not question their caregivers. Some may not even fully understand that what's being done to them is wrong. For example, a developmentally disabled adult might think being belittled or locked in a room is just part of life because they've known nothing else. As an EMS provider, you might encounter dependent adult abuse in calls like a developmentally disabled adult with an unexplained injury or a bedbound younger adult in poor condition. You'll use similar observational skills as with elder abuse. Look at hygiene and environment. Is the person unkempt, in dirty clothes or bedding? Are they malnourished or dehydrated? Do they have frequent injuries with odd explanations? Sometimes the signs are subtle. Maybe the patient has pressure sores that shouldn't happen if they were being turned and cared for. Or you notice the caregiver talks about the person in a demeaning way in front of you, saying things like, "He's always causing trouble. He fell again because he doesn't listen." Those could be clues. Also, just like with domestic violence, the caregiver's behavior can be telling. If they seem overly defensive, won't let the patient speak, or you sense something off in how they interact. Dependent adult abuse is a bit less talked about than child or elder abuse, but legally and ethically, it's just as important. Many jurisdictions include dependent adults in their mandated reporting laws alongside children and elders. We'll cover that in the EMS responsibilities section. Remember that every human, regardless of age or ability, deserves to be safe from harm. If you suspect a vulnerable adult is being abused or neglected, it's our duty to act on that. We will also see a scenario example of this later on. In the next lecture, we will switch our focus to the types of abuse by nature: physical, sexual, emotional, and neglect, and talk about the signs and symptoms you should be looking for on your assessments. See you then.